Welcome to Lesson 2 on photosynthesis. Starting with SC3, describe the conversion of glucose to starch. So watch the video and listen carefully to answer all of the questions 1 to 5. Glucose is a type of sugar molecule. There are many different types of sugar molecule, but glucose is the most simple. Here you can see a single glucose molecule. If you remember from last lesson, glucose is made from 6 carbon atoms, which you can see in black, 12 hydrogen in white, and 6 oxygen, which you can see in red. Sugars are also members of the carbohydrate family, as are starches. So let's have a look at how sugars and starches differ. Glucose is a single molecule, whereas starch is many glucose molecules bonded together. You can see here it's a series of chains of glucose molecules linked to one another. So if we think of these marshmallows as being our individual glucose molecules, let's have a look at how we convert these individual glucose molecules into a starch molecule. So in order to become a starch molecule, what has to happen is that each of the individual glucose molecules needs to be chemically bonded to the next one. So I'm using thread here to represent the chemical bonds, and I'm just threading each of my glucose molecules on, and you can see there then that they are kept together, held together by these chemical bonds. One molecule for the train, one molecule for Dougie. Okay, maybe 2 for Dougie. So as we keep chemically bonding more and more molecules of glucose together, eventually what we end up with is a chain or network of molecules, glucose molecules, and we call this large chain a starch molecule. So the large chain is a starch molecule, and it is individual glucose molecules held together by chemical bonds. So we learnt last lesson that photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplasts inside of a palisade cell. But once the glucose has been produced, it needs to be stored as starch. And if you look here, I'm drawing on little red dots to represent how the starch is stored. So starch is stored inside these tiny organelles called starch storage granules. The more photosynthesis has been occurring, the more starch storage granules you'll find inside of these cells. During the winter, there will be a lot less of them. No, this isn't a sad face. This is a palisade cell. Actually, maybe I should draw the vacuole then. There we go. This is a palisade cell, very badly drawn. But let's look at why glucose can't just be stored as it is. Because glucose is so small, it can easily dissolve. And because it can dissolve into the cytoplasm of the cell, so remember the jelly-like substance, because it can dissolve into there, what that means is it can easily then just diffuse out of the cell and into the tubes that run throughout the plant, which are called phloem tubes. Dougie, stop whinging. Here we go, here's a sweet. So what will happen is if there is low sugar here, remember diffusion happens from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. All the glucose will start diffusing out of this cell and it will end up with no glucose left. So what happens is, or the reason that they need to store it in a nice starch storage granule, is because these big starch molecules, this is obviously a lot bigger relative to the cell size than it should be, but this can't dissolve. It's too big to dissolve, which means that it can't diffuse out of the cell. So when the plant needs a sugar, it will break one off like that, and then that can diffuse out and go off somewhere else where it's needed. So these tubes are like the veins and arteries of the plant, but they're called phloem rather than veins and arteries. So the whole reason then that they're stored as starch rather than glucose is because glucose dissolves and diffuses out, whereas starch doesn't dissolve and diffuse out. Okay, so you may well remember when we did about enzymes before, that enzymes are kind of like the scissors of a cell. And what they do is they cut through chemical bonds. So, for example, I could use scissors to cut through this chemical bond here. Now, there are different enzymes which work on different molecules. So if you remember when we looked at carbohydrates, they're broken down by carbohydrates, but starches are not broken down by carbohydrates, they are broken down by amylase. So the scissors or enzymes that break down starch into glucose is called amylase. Okay, so here are all the perfect answers. Can you please make sure that you mark yours, comparing them to the perfect answer, please? Okay, moving on to SC4, list factors affecting photosynthesis. Make sure you answer the questions in this section as you watch the video. So let's start by looking at the 5 main factors which will affect the rate of photosynthesis of any plant. So a top tip here is to look at the word equation and think about what things you need for photosynthesis to happen, because that's immediately going to tell you what some of the limiting factors are going to be. So our first limiting factor is our first reactant, carbon dioxide. Obviously, if there isn't any carbon dioxide, the plant isn't going to be able to photosynthesize. The less there is, the slower photosynthesis will be. The next limiting factor is of course going to be the other reactant, water. If the plant doesn't have enough water, it cannot photosynthesize. The less there is, the slower the rate will be. The next limiting factor is sunlight. During the winter, plants will photosynthesize much less than during the summer. At night, plants can't photosynthesize at all. Okay, moving on to limiting factors that can't be found in the word equation. The next one is temperature. Different plants will have an optimum temperature for photosynthesis depending on what climate they have evolved in. But optimum temperature can really affect how fast photosynthesis happens. If it is too cold or too hot, it will slow it down. The last limiting factor which can affect the rate of photosynthesis is how much chlorophyll there is in the chloroplasts. You can tell this by looking at how green a leaf is. During the summer, the leaves are all bright green because they are doing lots of photosynthesizing. As the winter comes, they often turn red or orange, which means that the chlorophyll is breaking down because they won't be photosynthesizing as much. You may well have seen plants being grown in a greenhouse like this one. This is because you can control many of the factors which limit photosynthesis. For example, you can keep the humidity high so the plants have lots of water available. You can keep the temperature at an optimum level by using fans and opening and closing doors. Pump in carbon dioxide so as to keep the levels nice and high. And of course, the light intensity is far greater in a greenhouse. Okay, so the last question in SC4 is a thinking question, which means I am not going to be telling you the answer. I would like you to try and work the answers out yourself. Yes, it's time to use your brains, boys. Make sure you don't go any further unless you've answered all 3 questions fully. If you have, then it's time to mark our answers. Pause on each of the pictures. I've done example answers, but you might have something slightly different. But hopefully this will give you a good idea of the kind of thing you should have written. Don't move on unless you've marked your answers thoroughly. Okay, on to SC10, outline the role of palisade cells and chloroplasts. In the box provided, your job is to draw a diagram with labels of a palisade cell. You can see the diagram here. You also need to leave space for a short explanation of the role of chloroplasts. Please pause on this picture now and draw it neatly using a pencil. Okay, now it's time to move on to annotating our diagram, which means explaining the role of chloroplasts. If you have a look at this chloroplast diagram, you can see it is a very complicated organelle, but don't worry, you do not need to learn these labels. So you can see some real chloroplasts here inside these palisade cells. So the important thing that you need to annotate onto your diagram is that chloroplasts contain chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is the green pigment that absorbs sunlight. The green pigment that absorbs sunlight. And remember, sunlight is what powers photosynthesis. You should not be moving on until you have finished drawing and annotating your diagram. SC11 is to outline the role of xylem in transporting water to the leaves. The roots of a plant absorb water from the soil, but this water then needs to get all the way from the roots up to the rest of the plant. This means it needs to go through the stem or trunk to get to the leaves. So how does it do that? It travels through hollow tubes called xylem tubes, which you can see here on the left. Although plants obviously don't have a heart, the xylem are essentially like their blood vessels. So just like our blood vessels carry things all around our body, their xylem tubes carry water up from the roots to the leaves. So what you need to do now is pause on this picture and draw only the xylem on the left-hand side, and then you need to add the labels as well to explain the role of the xylem. So you only draw the left-hand picture. Okay, so only move on to the next stage if you have done the xylem tubes. Moving on to SC12, outline the role of phloem in transporting sugar to the growing parts of the plant. Here you can see what a phloem tube looks like on the right-hand side. Just like the xylem, the phloem tube is like a blood vessel, i.e. it carries things all round the plant. Unlike the xylem, which carries water to the rest of the plant, the phloem tubes carry the plant sugars to the rest of the plant. So all of the sugars that were made in the chloroplasts in the leaves during photosynthesis, they need to travel to other parts of the plant that need to grow. So the phloem tubes will take them from the leaves that are photosynthesizing and take these sugars to other places where they are needed for growth. So your job now is to pause on this picture and you're going to draw the picture of the phloem, which is on the right hand side. Do not draw the xylem, just the phloem. You need to make sure that you add the labels as well and briefly explain the job of the phloem. Do not move on until you have completed your phloem diagram. By the way, but when you look at this leaf here, you can see the xylem and phloem tubes. They're what we call the veins of the leaf. They're the xylem and phloem tubes. They're inside of there, and you can see them networking throughout, just like our network of blood vessels. Time to upload to Shobi, so you need to take a picture and you need to upload it to lesson 2 in week 7. I'm on the year 7 one here, but if you're in year 8, obviously you will be in the year 8 one, and you just simply press the plus to upload. This is slightly different for my year 7s because it's not in a separate folder. I've decided to just keep things simpler, and you just upload it straight into the lesson, please. Can you all make sure as well that you're taking photographs from straight above, like a bird's eye view, because it's much easier for me to see them. Thank you. And that's lesson 2 completed. Well done.